Hello, everybody. Welcome. It's my pleasure to welcome you to the FHABC Speaker Series this Tuesday evening. About the FHABC, the Forest History Association of British Columbia has been active since 1982, and we promote the preservation and appreciation of BC's forest past. Our current programs include a long-running newsletter, an online book club, the Speaker Series, and other programs. We're currently looking for new members. Dues are only $20 a year and enable the work we do. We're also seeking new directors, editors, and social media managers, and anyone with new projects that deserve to be explored. Please take a look at our website, www.fhabc.org, and consider joining us. About the Speaker Series. The purpose of the Speaker Series is to learn together by understanding the motivating spirit of other times. By understanding the path through which we got here, we may better chart our collective course ahead with wisdom and with clarity of thought. To this end, we seek to uplift a diversity of voices on BC forest history and historiography. We meet monthly through the fall, generally on the third Tuesday of every month, and new this spring are occasional meetings just like this one. So please keep an eye on our website for future talks and announcements, or if you become a member, have updates sent to your email address directly. My name is Alan Larocque, and I'm your host tonight. And tonight's speaker, it is my pleasure to welcome Jennifer Houghton. Jennifer is campaign director for the New Forest Act project with the Boundary Forest Watershed Stewardship Society, a grassroots citizen-led organization based in Grand Forks, BC. She co-authored the New Forest Act legislative framework. Her work focuses on educating the public and government about the structural problems in BC's forestry system and the changes required to improve outcomes for forests and communities. Her talk tonight is titled Same System, Same Results, A Century of BC Forestry Without Structural Change. And with that, Jennifer, I'll hand it over to you.
Thank you so much, Ellen. It's really great to be here. So I'm going to take a moment now to do the techie stuff and try and share my screen properly. So please bear with me, everyone, while I do this part. First, I need to click on this. I have to talk myself through it one part at a time. Then click on that. All right, is my screen looking okay? Okay, thank you so much. Well, Ellen, I want to thank you very much for this invitation, and the Forest History Association of BC as well. I'm probably not the usual kind of presenter here, so I appreciate it. Like you said, I co-authored the new Forest Act legislative framework, and most of my work focuses on presenting to the public and government audiences, analyzing BC's forestry system, and in plain language, explaining how it operates. And also why legislative replacement is necessary if we want different outcomes for forests and communities. Because this is the Forest History Association, I'm going to approach this differently than I usually do. This is not history for its own sake, it's history with a purpose. The question I want to examine is this. Why has BC experienced a century of forestry reviews, commissions, and policy updates, administrative adjustments, and even new regulations and laws, and yet the outcomes on the ground remain remarkably consistent? So this slide shows a timeline of just some of the laws, regulations, reviews, etc. It's clearly not everything, not all the guidelines that have ever been produced. And thanks to Keith Moore, who made a presentation to the History Association in December. He had a nice chronological list that helped me out a lot. I'm going to come back to this again later. My thesis is straightforward. BC forestry has undergone administrative change without structural change. And if the structure does not change, the results do not change. Here's the simplest way I know how to say it. BC's forestry system is like a vehicle heading towards a cliff. The problem isn't the engine, it's the direction and who's holding the wheel. For 100 years, BC has tinkered with the paint job, written new handbooks, changed language, launched commissions. but it has avoided the central question: why is the vehicle being driven in this direction at all? So when I say structure, I mean four things. Number one, what the system is optimized to produce. Number two, who holds durable statutory rights and decision-making leverage within the provincial framework. And three, how harvest levels are set and defended. And four, where accountability lands when harm occurs. If those four things do not change, you can reshuffle processes forever and still get the same outcomes. Now, this is not about blaming individual foresters. Professionals work inside parameters. It's the parameters that shape results. Also, I want to be clear, when I say rights in this context, I'm referring to rights created or administered through provincial forestry legislation, such as tenure rights, cutting rights, and decision-making authority. I'm not referring to constitutional Indigenous rights and title, which are recognized separately in Canadian law. So tonight's focus is on how the provincial legislative structure allocates timber and governance. From the beginning, BC Forestry has contained attention. On one side, ecological stewardship, sustained forests over time. On the other side, industrial extraction. Initially framed as supporting mills and communities, but increasingly structured around maintaining high timber flow within centralized tenure systems. That tension was present in early sustained yield rhetoric. Sustained yield was defined as maintaining a continuous annual harvest based on projected regrowth and rotation cycles, primarily to ensure long-term industrial supply. But how it functioned in practice matters more than how it was defined. In theory, sustained yield was meant to prevent liquidation logging. It was supposed to ensure forests could continue producing timber over time. In practice, in BC, sustained yield became operationalized through the allowable annual cut system. Harvest levels were determined through long-term growth projections and modeling assumptions. Ecological limits were incorporated into modeling, but they were never binding constraints. The 1999 Fall Down Report put it bluntly. Sustained yield is an entirely hypothetical term that has had no concrete manifestation throughout British Columbia's history. And that's a remarkable statement in a history context. It suggests that the organizing promise of the system was never structurally realized. Across decades of reform language, three structural constants remained. Number one, decision-making remained centralized. AAC determinations and tenure structures concentrated authority at the provincial level. Two, success remained tied to timber flow. Stability meant maintaining harvest volume. And number three, ecological limits remained negotiable. They were variables inside models, not fixed caps. Administrative language evolved, processes evolved, but those structural conditions did not. Forests became something to allocate, not something to design governance around. Excuse me. Here's the repeating loop BC returns to again and again. Harvest expands, industrial capacity expands, forest condition or timber supply reality catches up, communities absorb the impact, government launches a review, language and tools change, structure remains intact. So somebody sent me this clip from the Western Lumberman publication from 1912. And the highlighted portion there in the middle indicates that even in 1912, the language of exhaustion was already present. The Western Lumberman calculated that the then current production rates, if they kept going, the province's forests would be exhausted in roughly 100 years. So that awareness existed at the beginning of the industrial expansion. In the 1990s, the issue became fall down, even earlier than that, as a matter of fact. And the fall down report itself stated that allocations exceeded long-term timber supply by roughly 20% province-wide. It also said plainly that fall down is essentially overcut. That was 25 years ago. The late 90s and early 2000s experienced massive job losses and mill closures. Then later in the 2000s, the issue became beetle salvage, and the mills continued to close. In the 2010s and 2020s, wildfire, fiber shortages, and more mill closures. And the severe impact that these job losses have had on local economies, especially considering the semi-rural nature of many mill locations, makes entire communities economically vulnerable and structurally dependent on decisions made far outside their region. So each crisis generated reports, but the allocation model did not change. The structure remained the same. Structural continuity is also visible in tenure concentration. Fall Down noted that 10 companies controlled nearly 68% of corporate AAC in 1999, but that wasn't new in 1999. This is an image from the Kettle Valley Rural Study, which was made in 1979. And it observed that an industry once composed of many small independent operators had become dominated by two large corporations, with increasingly vertical and horizontal integration, making it increasingly difficult for the smaller independent operator to compete. Centralization was not an accident, it was embedded. Now, as of 2021, the concentration has gotten even more extreme. So this is from an article in the Prince George Citizen. Of the roughly 48 million cubic meters of harvestable timber held within BC's Crown Forest tenure system, about 27 million is held by just 5 companies: Canfor, West Fraser, Western Forest Products, Interfor, and Tolko. So I want to ground this in measurable outcomes. Provincial harvest levels have declined significantly from historical highs, and this decline is not random. So this shows the cut back in 1950 was 19 million cubic meters. It zoomed up in 1980 to 75 million and then gradually came down. 2025, it's about 35 million. And so this reflects front-loaded harvesting, particularly of old growth and beetle impacted stands that cannot be repeated indefinitely. At the same time, fiber quality shifted. Large diameter old growth was replaced by smaller second growth. Defect increased. Cost per cubic meter rose. Value per cubic meter declined. Yet the system continued to measure success in cubic meters. So volume remained the organizing metric. We also need to be clear about what a volume-based structure does to landscapes over time. When success is measured primarily in cubic meters, the system prioritizes maximizing harvestable volume within the timber harvesting land base. And over decades, that produces predictable ecological consequences. Stand structure simplifies, age class diversity compresses, large, structurally complex old forests are replaced with even-aged managed stands. This analysis by David Broadland shows the age of some of BC's interior TSAs. So the Lakes TSA, 40% of the THLB is less than 20 years old. and over half of that is under 10 years old. 100-mile TSA, 33% of the THLB is under 20 years old. And then Quesnel, Kamloops, Prince George TSAs, 26% of the THLB is under 20 years old. And further consequences, landscape connectivity declines. I think I went back to the wrong slide here. Landscape connectivity declines, hydrology changes, and when extensive areas are harvested within compressed timeframes, watershed function is altered. Peak flows increase, and that's what we experienced in Grand Forks. Water retention capacity decreases, soil stability declines, and wildlife habitat fragments. So this was the state of Grand Forks in May 2018. And the magnitude of the spring freshet was greatly increased because of the degree of clear cutting across the watershed. The boundary watershed is, or the Kettle River watershed is about 8,000 square kilometers. It's been 60 to 70% clear cut over the past 30 to 40 decades, and hydrology is severely damaged as a result. The hydrological function is damaged. Soil stability declines as well here. So this is a slide, a huge landslide that occurred below a clear cut. Wildlife habitat fragments, species that depend on interior forest conditions lose range, biodiversity narrows, and that's not because foresters intended degradation. It's because the structure rewards volume extraction within a defined land base. Ecological limits are incorporated into planning, but they remain negotiable within the model. When disturbance events occur, wildfire, flood, and drought, the simplified landscape is less resilient. The system externalizes ecological cost while internalizing timber flow. Over time, the landscape reflects what the structure optimized for. If the structure optimizes volume, the landscape reorganizes around extraction. These structural patterns produce other visible outcomes. Over 55,000 direct forestry jobs lost since 2000, and close to 100 sawmills closed. This image is a map of just a few of the more recent mill closures, the past 2 or so years, and I think some of them are even missing of the recent ones. There's been quite an avalanche of mill closures lately. Public costs have exceeded direct revenue by billions over a decade. So a few years ago, David Broadland did an analysis and found it costs BC taxpayers an average of $365 million a year to prop up the forest industry. And even if you don't agree with that analysis, there are millions in direct subsidies going to private corporations, including at least $235 million from the Forest Enhancement Society. And Mark Carney recently promised $1.2 billion in federal funding for the Canadian forest industry. And then we have floods, fires, drought, and landslides. And again, these are often described as external crises. But when cumulative harvesting alters watershed structure and forest composition, these events are not entirely external. They become system outputs. The Mackenzie region, the Mackenzie TSA, shows how the structure works in practice. So I'm going to refer to this report by Radis and Watts, which was leaked last year about the Mackenzie TSA. So for the Mackenzie TSA, the base case was set at 2.97 million cubic meters. The new AAC was set at 239 cubic meters. And the independent evaluation concluded that the land could likely sustain closer to 1.6 million cubic meters in the short term. And that's not a marginal difference. Also, the base case assumed 740 hectares of THLB would burn annually, but in 2021 alone, roughly 55,000 hectares were within wildfire perimeters. The modeling assumed disturbance levels that did not reflect observed reality. And it's important to note that the timber supply modeling framework used in Mackenzie is not unique. It's the same timber supply review system used across BC's TSAs. Ecological limits were not binding caps. They were adjustable variables inside a supply model. And this is not about individual judgment errors. It reflects how the system is designed to function. It is structural. And then the boundary TSA shows similar patterns in a 2009 report written by Britneff and Watts, and I see Anthony Britneff is here with us tonight. Britneff and Watts did a submission to the government about this 2009 report, where the Forest Inventory Branch indicated that some of the modeling for the boundary TSA overestimated stand volume by approximately 20%. But the Chief Forester did not consider this possible overestimation when setting the AAC for the boundary TSA in 2014. And of course, the AAC review was supposed to have been done, I believe it was in 2024, or it might have been last year, but it hasn't been done yet. So the AAC that greatly overestimates things still stands. And we lived with the consequences of overcutting in the boundary TSA. As the report Fall Down put it, reliable long-term projections are fundamentally uncertain. But when the structure rewards committed industrial volume, the system leans towards maintaining flow. And it rationalizes reductions later by attributing them to external factors, beetle, wildfire, market cycles, or regulatory delay, rather than to the earlier harvest trajectory itself. So this is a screenshot from the film from 1980 called The Fall Down Effect. You can watch it. It's quite interesting. It's available on YouTube. And it includes a line from the Chief Forester. He said, on the second crop, we will be cutting much younger trees, so the volume in the second rotation will be less per acre than from the old stockpile. That old stockpile was a bonus, a gift from nature, but we won't have it the next time. So that recognition existed decades ago, that the first rotation was unique, but the system structure did not adjust. Commission after commission has spoken about environmental values. As Keith Moore outlined in his December presentation, review after review refined administrative tools from forest management agreements to FHRPA, the Forest and Range Practices Act, but the allocation architecture remained intact. So this is some slides from Keith's presentation. And the highlighted part shows how government sets objectives, but licensees decide how to meet them. So all of those guidelines and recommendations were always voluntary, and it was really hard to get people to voluntarily follow them, is what the comment is there that's highlighted. So over the years, FHRPA specifically shifted approval toward professional reliance. Oversight thinned, responsibility dispersed. So when problems arise, the system can say the steps were followed, the plan complied, but compliance is not the same as structural adequacy. Recent reviews follow the same pattern. Old growth strategic review, recommendations, not binding redesign. The Provincial Forestry Advisory Council, their report From Conflict to Care, BC's Forest Future, recommended process improvements, modeling transparency, role clarification. better coordination between ministries, and improved communication of AAC rationale. Those are all process refinements within the existing allocation structure. And yet the structure remains. Centralized AAC, tenure-based delivery, volume optimization. 100 years later, BC is still reviewing. Today, when timber supply tightens, responses include marketing initiatives. Ravi Parmar has gone to London, he's gone to Asia, talking about trying to open new marketing offices there. Responses include AAC reallocations, strategy documents, new program layers. And these may be rational within the system, but they do not redesign the system. So public messaging speaks of change, but outcomes track the same curve. Here is the structural issue. The system is optimized for throughput. And you can see from this graph, again created by David Broadland, the red line is the AAC, and the gray line is the actual harvest. When overshoot becomes visible, harvest levels are adjusted downward after the fact. When fiber quality and supply decline, new markets are sought. When harvest drops, causes are attributed to beetle, wildfire, permitting delays, global markets, or regulation. And all of those may play roles, but none of them alter the central design. If the structure rewards volume and centralizes allocation, instability is predictable. Same system, same results. A system designed around continuous timber flow will eventually undermine the conditions that make forestry possible. Over time, forests simplify, risks accumulate, communities absorb volatility, disaster costs rise, and those are not side effects, they are system outputs. So do we continue adjusting the system or replace the framework? Do we redesign how authority is allocated, how harvest levels are determined, and how accountability is enforced? This is the pivot. If the machine keeps producing the same results, those are the options. And this is where the new, so replacement of the framework means redesigning how authority is allocated. Did I already say that? Yes, I did. This is where the new Forest Act proposal enters. The NFA is not another review, it is a structural redesign proposal. So structural elements in new legislation would require binding ecological thresholds, reorganized decision authority, a redesigned tenure architecture, and a transition pathway. The first thing I want to clarify about the new Forest Act proposal is it's not a fully drafted bill being tabled tomorrow. It's a legislative framework for replacement, not amendment. It outlines the structural elements new legislation would require. So it's built to change the structure so the system stops producing the same failures. Ecological integrity is a binding constraint. It focuses on place-based decision-making. So people who live in the region get to make the decisions about forestry in the region. Tenure concentration is addressed through restructuring. And in fact, under the new Forest Act framework, tenures would be eliminated over a 1 to 5 year period at their renewal point. And that would change a lot of what's happening in forestry. Also, one of the critical elements is that forests are treated as public infrastructure. Forests provide us with critical services and they should be maintained in standing form so that they continue to provide those services. Clean water, they manage our climate for us, and they essentially help humans to survive. If you were interested in reading the details of the NFA framework, you can find that at www.boundaryforest.org. At its core, the new Forest Act has three organizing pillars: ecological integrity, community-based decision-making, and community economies. And what that means is, instead of asking how to maintain flow, the system must first ask what outcomes are non-negotiable. And all three of those are. That's the design shift. So this is where I tie it back to the title. A century of BC forestry shows us something uncomfortable. If you don't change the structure, you don't change the results. You just change the wording. The new Forest Act is an attempt to do the opposite. Change the structure so different outcomes become normal, not exceptional. Forest history tells us something important. Every forest statute eventually reaches its limits. And as Anthony Britneff recently reminded me, legislation has an expiry date. The real question is whether the current framework is adequate for the conditions ahead. The outcomes we're seeing suggest that it is not. BC forest history shows us that the founding tension between ecological stewardship and industrial extraction was never structurally resolved. We adjusted the paint, we rewrote handbooks, we launched reviews, but the machine kept driving in the same direction. If we want different results, we must change the structure. Otherwise, history will continue to repeat. And until more people, including people within the system, begin talking about replacing the actual structure, the repetition is assured. So I'll end where I started. Forest history is not just a record of what happened. It's a record of what the system repeatedly chose not to change. And the question is simple. Are we going to keep adjusting the paint job, or are we finally going to change the direction? Thank you.